All right, good morning. Scott Luton here with you live on Supply Chain Now, along with my cohort and co-host and supply chain guru, Greg White. Good morning, Greg. How you doing?
Hey, good, Scott. How are you?
Doing fantastic. And welcome to our audience for today's live stream. Of course, it's our Supply Chain Buzz, which takes place every Monday morning, 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And Greg and I really tackle the leading developments in the global supply chain industry. So no shortage of developments to keep your finger on the pulse of here lately.
Yeah.
Stay tuned for what should be a very informative conversation where we're going to be tackling, I think, 4 stories here today and a few other developments. So quick programming note before we get started. Greg, can you share with our audience who we featured on today's published podcast?
Yeah, today we featured Diego Pantoja Navajas, my good friend from Oracle, founder of Logfire, a cloud WMS system that got acquired by Oracle, and now he is the spokesperson. I'm going to call him spokesmodel for the folks at Oracle in regard to warehouse management. Was traveling all over the world, to talk about that and to share that with companies.
One heck of an intriguing conversation with a supply chain visionary, truly. So check that out wherever you get your podcast from. It was recorded from Modex 2020. And we really enjoyed Diego's camaraderie and his perspective on especially cloud, some of the cloud developments and technologies that's taken place in the WMS portion of the end-to-end supply chain industry.
Yeah.
All right, we've already jumped the gun and welcome to my co-host, Greg White. Of course, as everyone knows, is a serial supply chain tech entrepreneur and trusted advisor. So let's move right along to today. Let's talk about what today's significance is in the grand scheme of things. Today is April 27th, 2020. On this date, Greg, in 1667, just a few years ago, John Milton, who was broke and struggling at the time, sold Paradise Lost to a printer for 10 British pounds. Do you know what 10 British pounds equates to in US dollars, at least in 2020?
No idea. From 1667?
$12.37 in 2020 dollars. Have no idea what that was worth 400 years ago. However, I think it's pretty safe to say the printer got a deal.
Yeah.
On this date in 1981, Xerox, Monday morning, Xerox PARC, which stands for Palo Alto Research Center, which was a part of the Xerox family back then, introduced the computer mouse, which led to a series of bad puns ever since. Right, Greg?
Yes, that's right. Yes. And that was not Xerox's biggest contribution really in Palo Alto. It was some stuff they had laying around the basement that they let a young man named Bill Gates get eyes on.
That's right.
Right. So
I want to let's say hello to a couple folks who are already tuned in here. We've got John McCarthy, Wasim. We've got let's see here, Blaz Madivi. I think I'm close. My eyes aren't quite working. That's a small screen up to my left. But regardless, good morning, everybody. Glad to have you here as part of the Supply Chain Buzz. On this date in 1992, Betty Boothroyd becomes the first woman to be elected Speaker of the British House of Commons, which at the time had a 700-year history. How about that?
Wow. 700 years.
We
thought growth in our country was slow.
Right. On this date, and this is relevant to some of the things we'll be talking about on today's Buzz. On this date in 2005, the Airbus A380 aircraft made its maiden flight. So over 242 of these planes have been made. It was considered to be one of the first real competitors to the long, dominant, prestigious Boeing 747.
Yeah, put it out of business, basically.
Well, the A380 will stop being produced, they've announced, in 2021. Gosh. How about that? And I also found, over 1,500 747s have been produced. So while the A380 competed against the 747, and by some analyst accounts, decently, competed well. 242 planes have been made. So 242 versus 1,500. I think there's a clear-cut winner there, Greg. I don't know.
Well, air travel has changed a lot, right? We don't send as many people to a single point to be dispersed around the world. You can go to those various points around the world. So those big, heavy haulers just aren't as necessary. Yeah. Remember the L-1011. You want to talk about, I mean, that's even the precursor to the 747.
L-1011, right? Okay.
Yeah. Beautiful, big, gigantic aircraft. Haven't flown on one of those in a while and won't.
Quick shout out to Susan Moody. Good morning. Welcome to today's Supply Chain Buzz. All right, just a couple of quick notes before we dive right in. Today is celebrated as the Day of Russian Parliamentarism. In Russia, big parties are certainly going to be ensuing tonight, Greg.
Well, this is a big party week in Russia because May Day is Friday. So that's always been a big holiday in well, not always. In recent history, relatively recent history, has been a big day and continues even after communism fell there. So this is going to be a big week. Lots of vodka drinking.
In Moldova, it is Flag Day. Wow. In South Africa, it is Freedom Day. Really important holiday there. And in Finland, National Veterans Day. So with all that said, Greg, I think we're going to be diving headfirst into the buzz this morning. And just prior to tackling our first story, we're going to share an opening remark, something old that is new once again, something that we're seeing with a newfound sense of relevance, maybe in a broader sense. Tell more.
Well, so, as we monitor social media and we talk to people out there, we seem to be in this state where there are a lot of people sort of in despair. And you can see where people thought this was going to be relatively short-lived and relatively low impact, and the reality of the length of time that it's going to occur and the impact that it's going to have, which is going to be substantial and for nigh on half a decade, it is starting to sink in. So it made me think of the consulting project cycle diagram, or this is the technology hype cycle. So the terms aren't as important as the shape of the curve. And if you think about it, the trigger that we experienced was this seismic societal disruption. Obviously, the pandemic has had a big influence on that, but really what we did was, in very short order, we ceased operating as an integrated society, and everyone went home. That includes home from work, home from shopping, home from restaurants, home from various and sundry other things. And that has had a big impact. And people's expectations or optimism was inflated, as you see in the first peak here. Their optimism was inflated to think, okay, this is going to solve the problem. It's going to be quick and it's going to be over. Not knowing, of course, what really was going to happen. But people, I think many people are eternally optimistic, and I think we can all appreciate that. Then as the reality of the length and depth of this starts to come out, people are getting disillusioned. They're a little bit down, depressed, and concerned. And now they're wondering, will it ever be over? And when it is over, will life ever go back to what it was, or maybe even as good as it was? But what I see happening now is we're starting to see some hints of this slope of enlightenment, where more and more data and rational and reasonable and plentiful information is coming out that is starting to help us identify how companies have operated during this time. We're starting to see some countries who have not shut down, like Sweden, see some successes and not as much damage as they expected from the virus itself. We're starting to see more and more data and more anecdotal evidence of what's going on. And if you if you seek that out and you find that, I think then you will start to see that we're learning more and more, and that will enable us as we go into this next phase. I'm not going to call it a plateau of productivity, but really to getting into operating in life after the pandemic, that sort of plateau of knowledge and expertise and that sort of thing. So that is what I believe we're starting to see now. And it just struck me, this hype cycle, which I've seen, obviously being a tech guy, I've seen this over and over again. So
well, you got
I just thought I would surface that.
Yes. Well, I think it's highly relevant, especially during these times, and I appreciate you sharing. And you've got some big folks in agreement with you, just like Vicky. Vicky, good morning. Great to have you with us.
Very, very important people.
That's right. Oh, very important people. Real quick shout out to some of the other folks that we're seeing log in here. Joseph, who was a fierce competitor in the trivia game. Good morning, Joseph. Tinju, great to have you with us here. Keith Singleton, who, if you remember Greg, just a live stream or two ago, he was dropping some serious quotable quotes on all things leadership and continuous improvement. Keith, good morning.
Yeah.
And William Lynch, Apex colleague, Apex instructor, great to have you here. Look forward to your insight. Cassiano, good morning. Fred Tolbert, good morning, Fred, on the heels of our podcast last Friday with some really bright students over at UGA.
Yeah.
Okay. So a lot to get to, right?
Well, look, I think we're moving to a stage of being able to manage through this and manage beyond this. And I would just encourage people to look for that information that helps you understand what's coming, and it's becoming more and more reliable as we learn more. But we're going to talk a little bit more about that soon.
Absolutely. So one last note on the opening remark there. Joseph says, hope becomes fragile when your vision is obstructed, the process is open-ended, and your progress isn't obvious.
Yeah.
Excellent insights there, Joseph Moretta. Okay, so let's talk about, first story comes to us from Bloomberg and Yahoo Finance, all about keeping really a constant theme here, keeping the supply chain workforce healthy and protected.
Yeah,
which we've been talking about.
It's been an ongoing story, hasn't it?
It really has, and hopefully our efforts to really beat that dead horse is reaching more people that it might be in their blind spot. We all know about the importance of keeping the healthcare front lines and first responders, and really all of the key components of life as we know it, and the people that have to be in their roles for us to feel like we can be as normal as possible and protect our psyche, but the supply chain workforce has been the blind spot for a lot of folks. I think we've all been guilty of that. So new developments in this article published April 26 by Bloomberg and Yahoo Finance. So COVID-19, just like everything else, has been impacting food processing plants and slaughterhouses. So here's where we're at. And we'll lead off with the tough news, and then we'll give you some good news. So pork capacity in the U.S. at least is down about 1/3. So not yet accounting for the big closure announced Friday, which was another of Smithfield Foods' operation. This one in Illinois.
Right.
The first big poultry plants shut down last Friday. And in addition to that, as if that's not enough, Brazil, which happens to be the world's #1 shipper of beef and chicken, had its first major closure last week. So as JBS SA shut down one of its poultry plants there. And the hits keep on coming. Canada is not immune. Canada shut down a large poultry plant as well. So what is that? What is that? Who cares, right? The U.S., Brazil, and Canada. Who cares? Well, here's a challenge. Altogether, those three countries make up 65% of the world's meat trade. Some experts are warning that domestic shortages are weeks away. So check out this portion. What really got my attention, we've seen lots of doom and gloom, and we try to cut through the noise and really get to the things the signals that we should be paying attention to, all right, that more of the experts agree on versus some of the one-offs. This got my attention. So Smithfield Foods, the world's #1 pork producer, released a statement Friday, which included, quote, during this pandemic, our entire industry is faced with an impossible choice: continue to operate to sustain our nation's food supply, or shutter in an attempt to entirely insulate our employees from risk. It's an awful choice. It's not one we wish on anyone, end quote. If that doesn't get your attention, Greg, I'm not sure what will. I mean, what's your quick take before we finish up the story? Quick take on that quote and kind of the current state.
Yeah, it does get my attention because it seems like there ought to be a third option. I mean, we've seen companies on the front line who are protecting their employees and still being somewhat, if less productive. I mean, retailers, essential retailers, pharmacies and groceries all over the world literally are still doing that. So I'm a bit surprised at the extreme end there. And it harkens back to some of the numbers we talked about last week. I think it was on the Buzz as well, that though plants are shuttered and though we're talking about big portions of the production of meats around the world, I wonder now what these numbers mean as far as production capacity reductions overall.
Yeah,
because it was relatively small with the plants that shuttered last week, if I'm recalling correctly.
Yeah, I think from what I'm understanding here, one of the challenges, because there's over 800 facilities in the states that support the meat industry, I think what we're seeing is some of the really larger mega sites get exposed, but we'll see. Let's see how we'll see how this plays out. But of course, and as the chart there that we've got on the graphic there that comes from the article, as demand rate remains high and supplies decrease, of course, prices are going to surge. But here's some good news. Some plants that were shut down a month or so ago have come back online as they put countermeasures in place. That's good news. There's not been any big shutdowns in Europe yet. And the EU, by the way, represents 1/5 of the global meat trade. So that's good news. And perhaps the best news is that COVID-19, to date at least, has not been shown to be a foodborne illness. So that lessens our concerns maybe of what might come out of the slaughterhouses and processing facilities into in our homes as consumers. So that's good news. But still, for many longtime food industry leaders and veterans, folks that have been there and done that and seen a lot of different scenarios play out, this is very concerning. As per Brett Stewart, who's president of Global Agri-Trends, echoed what we've heard time and time again in recent weeks and months. Quote, "It's absolutely unprecedented," end quote. And we've heard that in different ways, shapes, and forms 19 times in the last 7 days.
It wouldn't be a show if we didn't say unprecedented.
That's true. Unfortunately, that is true. That's where we are. But really important, hopefully, one of the things we can all do here, if you're listening to this or catching the recording, is just be aware of the need to protect folks in supply chain, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because of how it can impact each of our lives. Whether it is the folks that put things on, that make the stuff, move the stuff, put it on shelves, sell the stuff to you, that hopefully are behind a lot of those plastic shields these days. There's so many good people working hard when they don't have to ensure life continues as normal as it can for so many of the rest of us, right?
Well, they do have to, actually, because I just read an article. They don't have to, right? But I just read an article that said you cannot get unemployment because you don't feel comfortable working because of coronavirus. So in a way, they do have to. But I think what's really important about that is I continue to see people who are working on the front lines having an incredibly uplifting spirit. And I've talked about that for weeks now, but the smiles on faces of people who are working at this time when they could be in that trough of disillusionment. I think they have more eyes on the future, more eyes on coming out of this, and maybe our eyes, out of this crisis. So, it's really impressive what they're doing. Continues to be. Can I just make a quick personal note?
Nope. No personal notes.
I can't help but think about this as we talk about this. Look, we don't have to have provocative headlines. But as we have, and this is our third week of doing this together, as we have effectively created somewhat of a news show here. I can see where this sort of creeps in. We don't need provocative headlines to get clicks, and it's a shame that a lot of media does do that these days. And it seems like you have to take an extreme position to get people to respond. But I would encourage people to, regardless of what you see in the headline, read the article, because it is so much different often.
Yeah.
And Scott, you did a particularly good job identifying the underlying conditions that might mitigate this provocative headline, and particularly with doing your own research to figure out what the actual statistics are behind provocative headlines, and even the data that is presented in the story, right? Because there are other sides to the story. Last week, we had a story similar to this, and we found that it only impacted about 17% of the meat production in the country. So I'm interested to see what this impact is. I have a feeling it is probably substantially higher.
Yeah.
Maybe not as catastrophic as this would lead you to believe, right?
Yeah. Dig deeper for sure.
Yeah.
Get your data and information and perspective from a variety of sources, and always look for, as Greg put it, the mitigating factors. They're typically, even if the sky is falling, the grass is green and the flowers still smell nice. So, look for well-rounded perspective. Okay, real quick before we move on to the next story here, and we're going to circle back to the food industry. I think in story number 3, Michael Irving agrees with your opening salvo there, Greg. And Russ Thorne, a good friend, Apex colleague, former president of Apex Atlanta, asks, so is it time to invest in spam yet? And he is trying to be funny. So as always,
I hope so.
He is. Russ, great to have you. I hope you're doing well, you and your family, and great to have you here, part of the Supply Chain Buzz. Okay. So let's move right along.
Meat. That's the question that needs to be asked.
So we're going to move over to aviation and aerospace in story number 2. And Greg, tell us what's going on.
This is a really complex story. Boeing and Embraer had a deal wherein Boeing was going to buy Embraer, which is a producer of regional jets and mid-sized propeller aircraft, but predominantly now have moved to regional jets. Boeing is backing out of that deal as of midnight Friday. Either party could back out for essentially any reason. They had a $4.2 billion offer on the table, but since coronavirus has hit, Embraer's valuation has plummeted to about $1.1 billion. Part of the issue was that this market was consolidating anyway. Regional jets, because of some conditions I'll talk about in a second, have come under pressure. Bombardier has already effectively sold to a combination of Airbus and Mitsubishi Heavy, and Embraer, in an effort to try to, I think, survive, and Boeing to try and capture this regional market and some engineering talent, some substantial engineering talent that Embraer has, wanted to buy them, but not at $4.2 billion now. Boeing themselves needs about, I'm reading my research here, about $30 billion of external funding themselves. So to quote Richard Abulafia from Teal Group and aerospace analytics firm, $4 billion means much more to Boeing than it did back then when they started these discussions. So it's a substantial hit for both parties. Embraer obviously not happy, and it is claiming that Boeing delayed decision making to get to this point where they could get out of the deal without penalty. Although they will pay $75 million to terminate the deal. That's little help to Embraer, but what's really put pressure on these regional jets is that pilots unions have a scope clause that limits the use of regional jets and the size of those jets. And Embraer's most recent model is just over that size limit, which means it can be used even less. Additionally, what is recognized around the industry is that airlines are going to lose around $314 billion in 2020, and it'll take 3 to 5 years for the airline industry to come back. So the prospect of building more and more of those planes and selling more and more of those planes is off.
Right.
Airbus has already cut production by 30%, and Boeing is looking at cutting production and layoffs. Airbus, of course, is a government entity that can't lay off people. They're based in Europe. But Boeing is starting to look at that as well. So it's
and if you
tough
read
time for both companies.
It is. And if you have never been paying attention, or if you don't have to because of your role to the aerospace industry, the so what here is pretty big. Boeing is the country's, at least the U.S.'s #1 exporter, and its supply chain upstream and downstream impacts thousands of companies, tens of thousands of, if not hundreds of thousands of workers and professionals and folks that depend on income. So we are closely monitoring what happens to Boeing, and no one hopes that they get things turned around, such as the 737 MAX, as quickly as possible, even in this vacuum that is a lack of demand for passenger travel and new aircraft. So we'll see what happens there. Good stuff, Greg. And man, Embraer, $75 million to walk away, or to as a parting gift, I guess. I don't know. That doesn't sound like a bad deal to me.
Well, I guess, except that they're already struggling to survive. So if I were them, when things come back around, figure out a way to limp through, possibly, is what they'll do, and take a lower offer when it comes back around. Yeah. But I think we're gonna have to start to see that uplift before any offer is going to come back from Boeing.
Great point. All right, so I'm gonna on story number 3 here. We're gonna dive into the article that was written by one of our favorites here at Supply Chain Now. It's Jennifer Smith with the Wall Street Journal. If you're not following her on social or all of her great stuff at the Wall Street Journal Logistics Report, do yourself a favor, become more informed, and check out her content. But this is gonna be like I already know this stuff to a lot of our followers. So, I would encourage our folks that are listening to today's Supply Chain Buzz in real time, comment and tell us what you think is in the blind spot of consumers and other folks that don't understand why the pivot that we're seeing supply chain industry make is so challenging.
Well, and if you can share this information with friends who aren't in supply chain, this is really, really valuable information for them as well. Right?
That's right. So as you see the title there, divided supply chains are challenging producers and retailers. So again, if you're a supply chain leader or professional, you're going to be thinking, okay, yeah, I already knew that. And that's probably true for many folks. Mm-hmm. But many consumers and folks that aren't in supply chain are seeing empty supermarket shelves. They're seeing stories of milk and crops and livestock being destroyed. And they don't understand the disconnect and the gap between those things that we're seeing. And on its face, it may not make much sense to many people. But when you start to think about the multitude of channels that are stood up within global supply chain, and we're going to highlight some of this, I think it will start to make sense. We'll start to make some of the connections here. So think about certain products, whether it is industrial rolls of toilet paper, that won't fit into our home bathroom. Greg, I'm not sure if the industrial size fits in the White household bathroom. Milk that's meant and packaged for food manufacturers and industrial production. Or when's the last time you bought a 50-pound bag of rice, Greg? Lately, any time lately?
I haven't, but I know people who have.
Yep. So, your average consumer, of course, doesn't buy any of those things, right?
Right.
But there are channels to get that those products that are produced a certain way and packaged a certain way to meet certain industrial consumers or customers. So it's very difficult to push all of those channels, those production processes, the distribution strategies and channels, shift all that over to meet the consumer demand, especially in a way. Because we're not talking about making the shift for 7 years of production. We're probably talking about more of a measurement in months, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's just not going to happen. As quoted by Joe Vernon as part of this article, he's a supply chain analytics leader at Capgemini North America, says it's really, quote, a non-starter. He goes on to say, quote, we're not seeing any kind of mass retooling. It doesn't make any sense from a capital or expense perspective. And we talked about that as we were talking about toilet paper in the last month or so.
Mm-hmm.
The toilet paper industry, this is extremely unprecedented. It's not pandemics don't really factor into toilet paper planning. If more than anything else, it's population, right? Steady rise in population. They find ways to bolster what is usually a pretty steady industry.
Yep.
It's very difficult to upend an entire industry and all of these hundreds of channels for what may well be, even 12 months, maybe 18 months of a new normal. And that's what Joe Vernon speaks to here. So think about the meat industry that we spoke about earlier. So products sent to restaurants, which of course, by and large, not across the board, but by and large, a lot of restaurants, of course, are shut down. Products from the meat industry look like and are packaged a lot differently than what we find in our grocery stores, of course. So consider this from Ursula Marks, a special project manager for specialty meat distributor Marks Companies. She says, quote, this is a good one. The changes have been like riding a tiger. Retail is busy, but it is all the cheaper cuts. The last mile of our supply chain has completely pivoted, end quote. Now that reminds me of a really popular series on Netflix right now, but what a great quote, because it's dangerous. It is unpredictable. It's unprecedented. When's the last time you hopped on a tiger? I thought that was a really good comparison of what we're facing right now and what these producers are facing, right, Greg?
Yeah, it is. And, if you think about it in its simplest terms, toilet paper is not the same product in commercial, right, or public facilities as it is in your home. So it's a very heavy lift for those people who are saying, why can't we just, right? It is a heavy lift because the product is completely different, and the tooling that works in a commercial or in a commercial environment won't work for the consumer product.
That's right.
So
want a quick departure here. Good stuff, Greg. I want to say hello to Michelle, who's part of the team, logged in on Facebook today, and Hope White, who is also a fierce competitor in our trivia challenge last week. Hope, good morning. A couple of comments from LinkedIn. Let's see here. William Lynch says talks about, he completely agrees, the multi-channel distribution that exists and how difficult it is to change that. He also says he saw this morning that beer is going stale in innumerable restaurants right now. That's great foreshadowing for a point we're about to make. And let's see. Michael says this question and topic reminds me of how many breweries are pivoting from beer to producing sanitizers.
Yeah.
Very smart pivot in my mind. Great point, Michael.
Also, our favorites at Granddaddy Mims.
That's right. Jumping in the fight and helping to make hand sanitizer, even though someone told us last week that they've always made hand sanitizer. Especially
Arguably, moonshine is always hand sanitizer. That's true.
Especially with their 140 proof. Good stuff. All right. So to round out this story number 3 here, the pivot that Ursula is talking about, Ursula Marks, where she says the changes have been like riding a tiger. She's talking about, one that global supply chains are facing, from moving business to business to consumer operations. It is extremely difficult. Other gaps that the food industry that some may not be aware of within the food industry. Farmers with product have no real vetted visibility into new sources of demand. It's not like they can log on to a reverse Amazon and say, okay, who needs pigs today, or who needs milk today? That doesn't work like that. Donations of product that otherwise must be destroyed requires new logistics problems, right? if in the event you do identify someone that can take uh, uh, hundreds of gallons of milk that otherwise will spoil, you still got to figure out how to get it there while you're still trying to firefight all the other problems that is related to this pivot and the general challenges we have in this pandemic environment. So all that stuff, as we wrap up here, all that stuff doesn't happen easily. And I like how Jennifer Smith, the author of this article, puts it, quote, rerouting goods to consumers that were produced at industrial scale involves more than a phone call or a quick email exchange.
I read that in the article. That's pretty impressive, because that's what I think people think it takes, right? And outside of knowing the intricacies of it, it does seem like everything. It seems really simple from the outside looking in.
That's right.
Couple other points there. Someone named Amanda did say that they bought a 50-pound bag of bread flour recently.
That's true.
And if you follow Amanda on Facebook, you'll note that she made good use of it, didn't she, Scott?
Delicious use. It's been tough to find bread flour here lately. I think everybody's making their own bread.
Another quick note: Publix has pledged to help by taking excess produce from farmers and buying it and then donating it to philanthropic entities. So that's a great move. And no, as you said earlier, no small task. So not only the cost of buying the goods, but also changing your supply chain to ship them to new facilities. Yep. Publix is a grocery store chain in the Southeast, for those who don't know.
That's right. One of the good news, Convoy, which is an incredible, innovative transportation technology firm based on the West Coast, but has an operation here in the Atlanta area, is standing up a new marketplace for donated food supplies. I can't remember their partner in that venture, but hopefully that will help us. You know, no one wants to waste food. No one likes to see milk being destroyed or anything else, right?
Right.
But the lack of process and a lack of crystal ball working really is one of the biggest things making that happen. I mean, you know, if there's not unfortunately, we're seeing livestock get slaughtered because as these processing plants go down, there's nowhere to put them, and no one likes to see that happening. So we've got some smart people across supply chain industry working to prevent waste in all of its forms, and hopefully we'll see some breakthroughs and some new creative ways of making that happen in the weeks ahead. But you know, instant gratification is prevalent everywhere else these days, but it hasn't quite overtaken global supply chain. Things don't happen because we want it today. A lot of things do, but some things are a little bit tougher to work through and execute on than others. All right, one last comment here, and this is related to, of course, the bullwhip effect, which I bet if any consumer that didn't know if there's anything that the consumer wasn't aware of 2 months ago that they probably heard more about today, bullwhip effect is probably one of them. Mary, who's joined us on LinkedIn, says, read the bullwhip effect in my text for operations and supply chain management. Any change in consumer demand makes a huge change through the supply chain to suppliers. Great point there, Mary.
All right. And delayed, and that's what we're starting to see, right? We're starting to see the bullwhip crack right now.
Absolutely.
I mean, the milk that we're spilling now was in production 6 weeks ago. Wheat, tomatoes, all of those things, they don't come out of the ground instantaneously, right? It takes months. So all of that was in motion prior to this seismic societal disruption.
Seismic societal disruption. Say that 5 times in a row.
Yeah,
that's tough.
Say it one time, even slowly.
All right. Quick side note here. So I had a little learning moment over the weekend. I recently subscribed to the Wall Street Journal's weekend edition, which I really enjoyed, the mix of news and some features and lifestyle stuff and you name it. Well, evidently, so we have 3 children here, 10, 8, and 7. And as my wife and I, Amanda, sat down to think about it, I guess we haven't had a regular newspaper since, they've been babies. So as I was sitting down to read this weekend's edition, Ben, my youngest, my son was he was like perplexed. He couldn't believe newspapers still existed, which I got a lot of chuckle or two out of. But then Gracie, my middle child, asked me, why are you reading the newspaper? That's an old people thing. So, I really blew their minds with this, but all that to say, there are still some outstanding publications that are in print. And of course, the Wall Street Journal is making the digital transformation like every other business is these days, but they still put out a great newspaper. And we're not going to cover it today, but as I believe William mentioned earlier, the $1 billion problem that's brewing in the beer industry because of what's sitting in closed restaurants and the overproduction of kegs and other lots and lots of beers for a lot of the events that aren't going to take place in 2020. So huge problem. We'll see how that shakes out. But hey, check out the Wall Street Journal, the weekend edition. My kids may not like it, but you might.
Makes you wish you were 23 again and you could help with that beer thing.
That's right. All right. So, Greg, I think story number 4, we're going to kind of share some more good news, and we can't get enough of that. So do tell.
Yeah. So this is actually a story about the UK, who they're in their afternoon, if they're joining us, just after lunch, and depending on where you're from, possibly right between tea, or right before or right after tea, depending on your personal tradition in the UK. But the British Retail Consortium has issued new guidance on how to get back to standard retail for non-essential retailers, that being non-grocery and pharmacy and the like.
Right.
And actually, this is a bit of that curve of enlightenment, right? That we're able to leverage the knowledge and the expertise and anecdotal evidence and experience of both government advice and lessons from these essential retailers and how they've operated during this time. And of course, it's been an evolution for them, but it can be a catalyst for starting up new retail for regular retailers. So just a quick few points, and these will probably be familiar with folks, but essential retailers have provided hand sanitizer. They've encouraged shoppers to visit alone. I have to admit, for some reason, I have felt compelled to at least go to the store with Vicky, my wife, whenever we go, if not go in. And I'm not sure why that is. It's not like I can stop her from getting coronavirus. Hey, stop there. Limiting entry, so limiting the number of shoppers that are allowed in, maintaining 6 feet or 2 meters distance in the UK, screens and whatnot at registers, or as they call them in the UK, tills. Extra cleaning, which Publix again has been doing, closing early during this time to clean and stock shelves during that time, and then encouraging cashless payment. And cashless payment was already prominent in Europe and the UK, but that made me think it will become even more so in the States. They are way ahead of us in Europe in terms of how you use cashless payment. The waving your card thing that we're so enamored of here in the States has been around for nearly a decade in Europe. So I can see those sorts of advancements occurring.
Love it.
The British. Sorry, go ahead.
Nope, go right ahead.
I was just going to say, Helen Dickinson, who's the CEO of the BRC, said, among other things, retail businesses can start trading again slowly and safely, and customers can feel confident they can be safe to return to shops. So the goal is to take the learnings that they've got and apply them to these retailers that are just about to open.
Yep.
Do so in a prudent fashion and do so with all these cautions in place. So hope, and I think this is a good learning experience for us here in the States as things start to reopen.
Yep. Great point. Want to go back a second to, we're talking about the beer challenges and really the glut of product. And Fred Tolbert on LinkedIn says that he did his part during the trivia game last week, helping to alleviate that glut. I love that, Fred. We're getting some Apex humor in droves here today. I tell you, between Fred and Russ and William, it's good to see. All right, so
Who knew supply chain could be funny?
but it's so boring, Greg.
Yes,
Tongue in cheek. That's for our good friend Chris Barnes.
that's
Okay.
right.
So good to wrap up on story 4, that good news, seemingly lots of lessons and best practices that we can apply here in the States that Europe and specifically the UK is putting in place. So, it goes without saying, but our best wishes and best thoughts and you name it to our friends across the pond as hopefully they break into the new normal as healthy and safely as they can. All right, so we're going to wrap up on a couple of points here, and we want to offer some high fives, right, Greg?
Yeah, this is fun to watch.
I'll set the table. Yes, I'm going to set the table, and then I want you to talk about the fierce competition that was. So last Friday, we had our first supply chain trivia night here at Supply Chain Now. Now, it was fun. It was rewarding. We had a blast, and we had a great competition. However, it came with some unforeseen challenges, some things that we're going to fix as we roll out our second supply chain trivia night, which is slated for May 13th at 4 p.m. And that's the delay between the live stream and the game and the platform itself we were using. But we're going to fix that. So, Greg, talk to the competition that was Supply Chain Trivia Night.
Well, first of all, it was broadly international, including Nikhil, who was up at 2:30 in the morning India time, trying to compete, and that particular Nikhil's particular experience gave us a lot of insight to that delay. So, as Scott said, we're gonna address that, but Chris Gaffney jumped out to a big lead, Chief Supply Chain Officer. Well, I guess we can't. I like to call him Chief Supply Chain Officer, but you can see his title right there, Vice President of Global Strategic Supply Chain at Coca-Cola. Jumped out to a big lead, fast start, obviously highly educated, and a slew of people in second, third, fourth, fifth place. Angie Reno was right there. Peter Heflin, Kathy Morrow Robertson, Sarah Barnes, Humphrey, Jonathan Townsley, until he had kid duty. He had to drop out in the last few questions for kid duty. And then Mr. Inventory, the anachronistic Mr. Inventory, unnamed, started moving up the board, and ultimately in the last two questions took over and then revealed himself to be Dimitrios Kolas from Bosch. Very impressive comeback. I was communicating with Chris over the weekend and said, I feel like you were the Kansas City Chiefs in the 2018 AFC Championship. If it hadn't been for D Ford jumping off sides, you would have beat the Patriots and gone last year. Next year is your year. This next event is Chris's event. I feel
well. To be fair, it came down to the second to last question. Chris led from the get-go, and it came down to the last question. We had, and folks, look, we weren't asking about how do you spell SNOP. No. We had some pretty tough questions, and so with great competition between Dimitrios and Chris Gaffney and Angie Reno. By the way, I loved her nickname, Reno 911. Which, if you're a Comedy Central fan, you'll get a kick out of that.
Well,
first, go ahead.
Really impressive, the knowledge that people had. I mean, these were really, really tough questions. It would have been hard to follow for somebody if you weren't a supply chain pro, and even if you were, you could see some really talented folks struggling with some of those questions, including Chris and Dimitrios on a couple. So.
That's right. Well, I just confirmed with my boss. Amanda has said that the gift cards will be going out today, and that's to our audience. Hey, these folks won money from us. Dimitrios at first place won a $200 gift card. Chris Gaffney, $75 gift card, and Angie won a $25 gift card. And even the $25 gift card will buy you at least 2 coffees at Starbucks, right?
Maybe more.
Well, congratulations to That's right. Congratulations to everybody that played the game. Look forward. Again, this is open to anybody that enjoys trivia and wants to. I would argue more importantly, as much as trivia is neat and it's great to win or compete, the camaraderie between all of these folks that are in different places around the world, different places in industry, I think that's what we all crave, especially in these days of isolation and quarantine. So May 13th, 4 p.m., we'll have the registration link on the website, supplychainradio.com, and we hope that you will consider joining us for the next go-round.
When you think about the little difficulty we went through in synchronizing this, it makes something I saw last night. Post Malone did a tribute to, you watched the Grand Ole Opry. I watched Post Malone doing a tribute to Nirvana. With remote musicians playing at the same time on the internet. They're obviously using some, I'm sure, really expensive technology to synchronize and time everything together. But you learn a lot about the internet trying to do this live. I mean, the various platforms are on different timings. And then, of course, the distance. Nikhil was at a bit of a disadvantage. We're going to try and close that gap because his answers were right. They were just delayed, right?
Yeah, we're going to fix that for sure. I can promise you next go round.
Come back strong in this next round.
That's right. Hey, quick insight. We're talking about the United Kingdom retail environment. One of our listeners here, Blas, and if I'm getting that wrong, I apologize. Blas on LinkedIn is saying, quote, have been experiencing the enormous change in the UK during my weekly shopping. Products are now fully stocked up. Cashiers have a protective window, and my hands always end up being dried up from the sanitizer they use on the shopping carts. Hey, better safe than sorry, Blas.
That's right.
Hopefully you're doing well. Best wishes to you, your family, and all of your fellow citizens there in the United Kingdom. Okay, let's see here. I think we've got one more announcement, and Vicky is weighing in on supply chain trivia night. Yes, we did have a great time.
Yeah.
And appreciate the team behind the effort here. Okay. One final. So we've got a webinar coming up May 27th. Registration will be open soon. So if you've been a regular listener here at Supply Chain Now, you're probably aware that we're big fans of not only Gartner's work, but specifically the top 25 supply chain rankings and top 15 supply chain rankings that they put out for the U.S. and Europe, respectively. Right. It always provides such a interesting discussion on best practices and gaps and what companies are doing to move forward, public companies, that is. So on May 27th, which is probably just a week or two after the top 25 supply chain rankings are released by Gartner, in their revised programming, which everyone has revised programming these days. We're going to be featuring our friend and ongoing collaborator, Mike Griswold, VP Analyst with Gartner, to share some of his key takeaways from the newly published, by that time, top 25 supply chain rankings here in the States. Greg, if you tune into any of our ongoing programming, Mike is not one to miss, right?
Mike is a practitioner before an analyst, so he worked in grocery and retail even before becoming an analyst. So he knows of what he speaks, and he brings that to every analysis that he does. And he is the arbiter of the top 25 supply chains. I think what's particularly inspiring about what they're doing, this is a big topic for us, is they've included corporate responsibility in their ratings for supply chain, as well as economic and operational factors. So they are encouraging and highlighting and rewarding sustainability and ethicality and fair trade in supply chain for these companies. And I'm certain there's going to be a bit of a shift at the top.
That's right.
So it'll be interesting to see how they always do such a good job of keeping it secret. I don't know how, but it's going to be interesting to see who comes out on top there.
It really will be. It really will be. And, CSR, corporate social responsibility, as is reflected in the top 25 rankings, has more respect and more of a weighted impact than ever before. And, of course, this week we've got AIAG's
corporate responsibility summit.
That's right. And we're looking forward to that. That we've seen so many best practices and thought leadership in this space that the consumers demand that companies account for. And you'll see that reflected in the top 25 rankings, undoubtedly, that will be released. So tune in. We'll have registration open this week for this webinar. It's not quite open yet. May 27th, 12 noon. And I promise you, it'll be an hour well spent here with Mike and Greg and Supply Chain Now.
Yeah.
All right. I think, Greg, that just about wraps up. Let's I want to give you an opportunity.
Oh boy.
To give us your patented hot takes.
Yep.
Your key takeaway or two from today's Supply Chain Buzz.
I think the biggest thing that I'm starting to see is we're starting to shift from that, if you think about it, stages of grief or whatever you want to call it, we're starting to shift into recovery mode. And I would encourage people to start to look for indicators that give you some idea where things are or could be going. Because we may be at the bottom, we may be approaching, or we may be coming up from the bottom of how this happens. And we want to be careful not to cause a relapse. But I got to tell you, I see a ton of diligence out there in the marketplace, people coming back into commerce safely and prudently, and yet boldly in a way to press things forward. Inform yourself, use real data, get past the headline, right? And trust yourself.
Yeah.
And trust yourself to get past even your own bias. Look at all sides of the spectrum and think about what makes sense as you press on. Yep.
Great point. I couldn't think of a better way to close out today's Supply Chain Buzz. So I appreciate that, Greg. Want to remind all of our listeners on that note, you can check out a wide variety of industry thought leadership at supplychainnow.com. Find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from, including today's session with Diego with Oracle, which you'll enjoy his perspective on all things cloud and all things warehouse management systems. And be sure to join us next Monday at 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time for the next version of the Supply Chain Buzz. Of course, you'll be able to get the audio version of today's Supply Chain Buzz in the next couple of days, wherever you get your podcast from. So on behalf of the entire team here at Supply Chain Now, Greg White and Amanda and Clay and Michelle and Vicky, you name it, all the folks that make Supply Chain Now happen, please stay safe. We wish you nothing but the best. Listen to the precautions from your local healthcare experts and providers. And remember this, brighter days absolutely lie ahead. And with that said, we'll see you next time here on Supply Chain Now. Thanks, everybody.